The letter arrived at Emma's doorstep on a rainy afternoon, yellowed and brittle as though it had travelled through decades instead of days. There was no return address, no stamp, only her name written in delicate calligraphy, Miss Emma Caldwell. Her curiosity flared as she flipped the envelope over and gently pried it open, revealing a single sheet of parchment. You are cordially invited to the Caldwell estate, a family legacy left in your care. The name Caldwell felt heavy, like a distant memory shrouded in fog. Emma's parents had never mentioned any estate, certainly not one worthy of an invitation. She tapped her phone to call her mother, but hesitated. Something about the invitation felt personal, like an old wound that didn't need reopening. The rain pattered harder against the window, and Emma decided. A brief drive, a peek inside, and she could return home to forget this whole eerie occurrence. The GPS flickered in and out, seemingly uncertain of the directions to the Caldwell estate, and Emma was left navigating narrow roads cloaked in fog. Tall trees flanked her on either side, their bare branches stretching overhead like skeletal fingers. The deeper she ventured into the woods, the thicker the fog became, until the road itself disappeared into a sea of white mist. A decrepit sign came into view, barely legible, Caldwell Estate, private property. Emma turned onto a gravel path, her tires crunching noisily beneath her. In the distance, the silhouette of a house emerged, obscured by the blanket of fog. Her first impression was one of grandeur faded by time. The mansion stood tall but weary, its stone facade cracked and overgrown with ivy. The windows were dark and vacant, giving the house a sinister sleeping presence. She parked her car, hesitating as the rain slowed to a drizzle. The invitation trembled in her hand, and for a moment she considered leaving. But the door to the mansion loomed ahead, an irresistible pull drawing her forward. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the scent of aged wood. The grand foyer stretched before her, dominated by an immense spiraling staircase. Paintings of unfamiliar faces lined the walls, their eyes following her movements. The invitation had promised a caretaker, yet the house seemed empty. "Hello?" Emma called, her voice swallowed by the cavernous halls. Only silence answered. She moved through the mansion with slow, deliberate steps, her fingers brushing over cobweb-covered furniture and faded tapestries. The house felt abandoned, yet there was a distinct sense of presence, as though it had been waiting for her. She found the dining room, the long table set for one, a silver candelabra standing cold and empty at the center. A clock somewhere in the house struck 7, its chime echoing through the corridors. Emma's phone buzzed. No signal. She wandered upstairs, finding a bedroom adorned in dusty opulence. The bed was draped in heavy curtains, the kind that might have once kept out a chill. Feeling a strange sense of exhaustion, she decided to stay the night, reasoning that daylight would reveal the answers she sought. As she drifted off to sleep, the house seemed to breathe with her, the walls creaking and groaning as though shifting in its slumber. The nightmare started subtly, a soft whisper in her ear like the gentle rustle of fabric. Emma stirred, the sound tugging her from sleep, but she remained in that murky space between dreams and waking. The whispers grew louder, indistinct but persistent, like voices conversing just out of earshot. Her eyelids fluttered open, and the room was awash in shadow. Something moved at the edge of her vision, a ripple in the dark. She sat up in bed, her breath catching in her throat as she scanned the room. The curtains swayed ever so slightly, though there was no breeze. Then she saw it. In the corner of the room, near the mirror, a figure stood, tall, thin, its face obscured by the shadows. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she blinked, and the figure was gone, as though it had never been there. She stumbled out of bed, flipping on the light. The room was empty, silent. Only her own panicked breaths filled the space. She moved toward the mirror, a large, ornate thing with a tarnished frame, and stared at her reflection. For a brief moment, she thought she saw movement in the glass, a flicker of something behind her, but when she turned, the room remained still. Unnerved, Emma decided she couldn't stay in the bedroom. She gathered her things and moved to a different room down the hall, leaving the door slightly ajar. She lay awake, staring at the sliver of hallway visible through the gap, her mind racing with the image of the shadowy figure. The next morning, Emma woke to the sound of birds chirping outside. The house seemed less oppressive in the daylight, though a lingering unease clung to her. She explored more of the mansion, hoping to find some clue as to why she had been summoned. In a small library on the second floor, she found a collection of journals tucked away in a corner cabinet. The journals belonged to her ancestors, the Caldwell family. The pages told of a history rich with success and tragedy. But it wasn't until she reached the last journal that things took a darker turn. May the 17th, 1895. The shadows have begun to stir. We thought it was the grief from the loss of Emily that caused them to appear. But now I see they are drawn to something deeper, something darker that we cannot name. June 2nd, 1895. The house sleeps now, but the shadows remain. They whisper at night, filling our dreams with dread. I fear what will happen when it fully awakens. Emma's heart raced as she read the final entry. June 12th, 1895. The house is no longer ours. It belongs to them now. I pray whoever comes after us knows how to quell the shadows, or they will be consumed as we were. Her hands trembled as she closed the journal. The words seemed to echo in her mind. The house is no longer ours. That night, Emma couldn't sleep. The house seemed different, as though it was aware of her now. She paced the halls, her footsteps muted by the thick carpets, but the whispers returned, growing louder with each passing hour. When she entered the dining room, she froze. The long table, once empty and covered in dust, was now set with an elaborate meal. Candles flickered, their flames casting eerie shadows across the walls. The chair at the head of the table had been pulled out, as if waiting for her. Slowly, Emma backed away, her heart thudding in her chest. As she turned, she caught a glimpse of something in the reflection of the silver candelabra. A shadow moving across the far end of the room. Panic surged through her as she sprinted up the stairs, the sound of her footsteps swallowed by the thickening darkness. She slammed the bedroom door behind her, pressing her back against it. But the whispers were everywhere now, filling the room, pressing in on her. The house was awake. For 3 days, Emma remained trapped in the house, her world shrinking as the shadows grew more aggressive. They whispered to her, called her name, moved just at the edge of her vision. She felt them now, felt their cold breath on her neck, their skeletal fingers grazing her skin. It was on the 4th night that the house finally showed its true nature. She had been sitting in the library trying to make sense of the final journal entries when the walls began to groan. The floor shifted beneath her feet, and the air became suffocatingly heavy. The shadows crept in from all sides, and for the first time, Emma saw them clearly. Twisted, dark figures, faceless but hungry. They surged toward her, their whispers turning into screams. Emma ran, but the house shifted around her, trapping her in endless corridors. The paintings on the walls twisted, the faces within them warping into grotesque smiles. As she stumbled into the grand foyer, the front door stood open, beckoning her. With the last of her strength, Emma raced toward it, her pulse hammering in her ears. But as she reached the threshold, a force yanked her back, pulling her into the darkness.